Thank you. So I lost my voice 3 days ago. It's coming back, but there's a strong possibility that someone will have to take over for me at some point. But the first thing that we're going to talk about is we're going to talk about team-based learning in the flipped classroom. How many of you in this room have employed team-based learning in your teaching? Awesome. A couple of you. Great. And then when you guys do team-based learning, do you typically do like a classic team-based learning with all the parts, or are you doing more of a modified team-based learning? Modified. And what level are your learners in here? Is most people medical students, residents? Great. Any other learners besides medical students and residents? Great. So we really like team-based learning at UCI, and we use it quite a bit. And I think that it's important because it's a way to utilize the flipped classroom in an effective manner. And so today we're going to talk about the necessary steps for classic team-based learning, the necessary steps for modified team-based learning, and we'll talk about how you can adjust those elements to meet the needs of your learners. So the flipped classroom, who can tell me, anyone in this room can tell me kind of what the flipped classroom means? Like, what do we mean when we say the flipped classroom? Anyone?
So the learners come in with a foundation of sort of preparatory material, and then they come to the classroom ready to apply it.
Exactly. So Kathleen told us that it's basically kind of flipping the order of homework and in-class preparation. When we think classically of this, we think of like high school, where you're learning something in high school and then you go home and then you do the homework. It's basically the opposite of that. So people are going to be doing the homework before they come into class so that they can utilize those concepts that they learned at home so that they can then apply it to case scenarios. And so it kind of brings us up Miller's pyramid. It gets us on a higher level of Bloom's taxonomy because we're getting to applying that knowledge rather than just kind of memorizing things and doing concepts. So the flipped classroom, and so team-based learning is a perfect adjunct to the flipped classroom because it allows those kind of in-class participation. So once we've flipped classrooms, so let's say, for example, we've done something at home. We have done kind of our flip, like we've done a podcast or something at home. And then once we get to the class, these are some ways that you can engage the learners post-flip. So team-based learning being one of them, oral boards with a debrief, so people could do the work at home and then go apply it in an oral board scenario or apply it in a simulation scenario. But right now we're talking about team-based learning. And so let's just define some terms quickly. So this is Brad from the University of Missouri, Kansas City. Yes, did I say that right? Kansas, dang it.
It's in Kansas City.
Dang it. Kansas,
That's
in
right.
Kansas City. I always say it wrong. So we'll talk about kind of what are some terms in team-based learning.
Here, I'll do this.
Perfect.
So the first part of this is the learner responsible content, or what happens before you get to class. And so this can be either reading material, some chapters in a book, or it can be watching some podcasts. In general, they recommend that this lasts an hour or less of work. It gets longer than that, and your students aren't going to do it. A lot of times with the way we do it with residency, or I do a lot with faculty development, is to accept the fact that they're not going to do any work before you get to class. And so then you can just do the learner responsible content in class. And so that's another option too. But most of the time it's the pre-class preparation. Ideally that's the way they get to think about it. They do the hard work of learning, just going through and learning material, as Megan said, at the lower levels of Bloom's taxonomy. Then they can get into class and start working harder on the application.
Yeah, and I typically, for my medical student learners, I absolutely have them do some pre-class preparation at home. But for my resident learners, they're in the ICU, they're in all these different places. So I don't necessarily want them to not come to class if they're not going to be prepared. Because if they come to class and we're relying on the fact that they did this pre-class preparation at home, then they might not come and they might not be prepared. And so sometimes we'll just do the learner responsible content at the beginning of the session, like a podcast. So the next term is IRAT, and this can either mean the Individual Readiness Assessment Test or Individual Readiness Assurance Test. So this is the next step in the team-based learning. So we talked about the at-home preparation. That's step 1 of team-based learning. Step 2 is always an IRAT, an Individual Readiness Assessment Test or Individual Readiness Assurance Test. This is usually in the form of multiple choice questions that they are answering in order to apply what they learned in the learner responsible content.
And the GRAT, or the Group Readiness Assurance Test, is the second part of that. So they'll do the individual sort of as their admission ticket or the first step. Then they'll form up into their teams, and they'll do the group test together. This is their chance to talk back and forth about what they think the answers are, negotiate their way to the final answer.
And typically the GRAT are the exact same questions that you asked in your IRAT. So the GRAT and the IRAT are identical, except for the fact that they're doing them in groups. And you can use the IRAT as, for example, they can turn it in and you can grade them to see if they actually answer the questions. And then as a group, they answer those questions together.
And a lot of times those are also on the lower level of Bloom's taxonomy
Exactly.
too. Those are just the, do you know the stuff? Can you regurgitate the information?
Yeah, and so there's a couple ways that you can do a GRAT. You can do a GRAT just with multiple choice questions, but typically they're done in this IFAT form. And so right now, again, we're just defining some terms. We're going to cement this a little bit more, but we're just going over these terms so you can be familiar with them. An IFAT is immediate feedback assessment technique, and basically all it means is that you have some way of your learners immediately knowing if they got the answer right. And so we use scratch-off stickers here so that learners can actually scratch off the answer to see if they got the answer right. So this is just a term that you'll want to know. And there's a couple ways that you can do this. You can buy scratch-off stickers, or you can buy the actual IFAT forms yourself. And then the last term is the group application exercise.
Yeah, so the group is, this is where they get to apply the knowledge. This is moving up Bloom's taxonomy to where they're thinking, they're manipulating, they're coming up with real-world answers. And so a lot of times these questions work best if they are meaningful to what they're going to use this material for. So solving patient-related problems or some other important event. Every group will have the same test, same exercise, and then they'll work on that together. Then they will generally come back together and report our answers together, and then that will begin a period of discussion and negotiation, and that's where, as the teacher, you really figure out what is it that people don't understand, where are the gaps in their learning, and then you can focus sort of your mini lecture on the gaps so that when you're teaching, it's really just what do the students not know and what do they need to know better.
So we defined some terms. We said that the 4 elements of team-based learning are learner-responsible content, so the pre-class preparation, the individual readiness assessment test where they come to class, they take a multiple choice question test, the group readiness assessment test, which is when they take that multiple choice question test together, and then the group application exercise. So now that we've defined some terms, we are going to participate in a team-based learning exercise right now all about cookies. And so you're going to learn everything there is to know about baking cookies. And you will become experts on cookie baking as well as team-based learning. So because we didn't want you guys to have to do some pre-class preparation, you're going to come to class right now, pretend that you're in class, and you're going to do the learner responsible content right now. So you're coming to class, and instead of having done the pre-class preparation at home, you're going to do it in the first 5 minutes of lecture. So we'll do that right now. So this is your pre-class preparation. This is your learner responsible content. This is the first step of the team-based learning exercise. Is the sound on? Perfect.
Do you ever have a hard time making the perfect chocolate chip cookie?
Shannon, what is your perfect chocolate chip cookie recipe? What does it include?
Well, there's chocolate chips, flour, brown sugar, white sugar, butter, vanilla, baking soda, eggs.
You're making me very hungry. But I think the proportion of those ingredients can really make a difference in the texture of your cookie as well as the flavor of your cookie.
You know, you're right. I actually think of cookie baking as more of a science than an art.
I've never thought of it that way. I like that. But you're right, absolutely right, because ingredients like flour can really make a difference in the consistency of your cookie. It can determine whether it's crumbly, it can determine whether it's chewy. For example, very dense cookies like biscotti tend to be very crisp, and that's because they have a very high proportion of flour. Whereas brownies, on the other hand, have a very low proportion of flour, making them more chewy and soft.
Interesting. The next ingredient that everyone thinks of when making cookies is sugar. Now, sugar gives cookies that irresistible sweetness that we all crave in a cookie.
I cannot imagine a cookie without any sugar.
I can't imagine it would taste very good. Now, there's 2 kinds of sugar. One's brown sugar.
And the other's white sugar. Now, white sugar tends to make cookies, when you have a higher proportion of white sugar in your cookies tend to be a little bit more crisp, as well as a little bit browner because of the caramelization process. If you look at these cookies were made with a high ratio of white sugar to brown sugar. And if you break them apart, you'll notice that they're a little bit crisper.
Brown sugar has a higher proportion of molasses. That means it will give your cookies a softer, chewier quality because it adds moisture to the cookie. Now when you break these open, they have that soft quality that some people like in their cookies.
Shannon, what sort of fat do you use in your cookies?
You know, it really depends. I think the recipe I have calls for margarine, but sometimes it's whatever I have lying around the house.
You know, there are a few important small differences between margarine and butter. For example, butter has a lower melting point than margarine, and so that tends to make cookies a little bit more crisper and a little bit flatter.
Interesting. So these cookies were made with butter.
They were?
That is a crisp cookie.
Yup.
So then if I made a cookie with margarine or shortening instead, it would have a higher melting point and would therefore be a less flat, or I guess thicker cookie, and would not be as crisp.
That's correct.
Wow, I'm learning so much today.
I know, it's a fun day. Shannon, have you ever wondered why cookie recipes call for eggs?
You know, I have, and when I was younger and a little geekier and had more free time, I looked it up once. And it turns out the egg provides protein that helps all of the ingredients mix together better. But additionally, if you add a higher proportion of eggs, for example, if your recipe calls for 2 and you add a third, it'll give you a chewier, cakier cookie.
Oh, interesting. Well, this morning I found out the hard way why baking soda is important for cookies.
You didn't have any baking soda?
Well, I did, but I just forgot to combine it. And baking soda actually aerates the cookies, making them a little bit more puffy. And so this batch this morning, I did forget the baking soda, and you'll notice that they're really pale and kind of flat.
Those don't look very tasty.
No, they're not.
Okay, well,
What about the salt? Have you ever forgotten the salt?
you know, I have, and I've actually compared 2 batches of cookies with and without salt. And while it seems odd, the salt provides an alternative flavor that really enhances and brings out the sweetness of the cookies. It's better with the salt.
I agree. I like a little salt in my cookies. So in addition to the ingredients, the way you bake the cookies can have a tremendous influence on how the cookies turn out.
Really? How so?
Well, so for example, temperature can make a difference. So these cookies were cooked at a higher temperature for a shorter period of time, and so they tend to be a little bit thicker and a little bit chewier.
That's a thick cookie.
And then these cookies, on the other hand, were baked at a lower temperature for a longer period of time. So these cookies tend to be a little bit thinner and a little bit crisper.
That is a big difference.
Absolutely. Which cookie do you think you'd like better?
I'm a thick, chewy cookie kind of gal.
Me too.
You know, my understanding is that mixing can also affect your cookies.
Absolutely.
Now, your mixing is important initially to combine all the ingredients together, but over-mixing can yield tough cookies.
We don't want tough cookies.
This has been so much fun talking to you about cookie science today.
This has been a lot of fun. Almost as fun as eating them.
Maybe not quite.
So good. All right, so you came to class and you just learned all this amazing stuff about cookies. And so this is an example of what our learners might learn, right? And obviously they're not going to be learning about cookies necessarily, but they might be learning about electrolytes or cardiology or something a little bit more exciting. And so you can see that as a learner, you're going to feel a little bit overwhelmed with just watching this podcast. So then you're going to break into the steps of team-based learning. So we want each of you to go through these steps. So this was the learner responsible content. This was step 1. They're either going to do this at home, they might do it when they come to class, or in modified team-based learning, you might just eliminate this completely because it might be something that you're building on this foundational knowledge that they already have. So let's go to step 2. Step 2 is the individual readiness assessment test. And so you should have an individual readiness assessment test in front of you. Dr. Wray has passed that out for you. And for your reference, we also gave you an article about baking cookies. So if you need to kind of reference this while you're taking your IRAT, the IRAT is the one without the scratch-off stickers. So this is not the IRAT. This is the GRAT. The IRAT, will you hand me that one right there? Nope, that one, yeah. The IRAT is this one without the scratch-off stickers. So this is what an IRAT looks like. It's an individual readiness assessment test. It's multiple choice questions. There's usually about 5 to 7. And go ahead and just take this individual readiness assessment test by yourself. see how you do. You can reference the article if you need some background information on cookie making. And spend about 3 to 5 minutes taking this IRAT.